Hey, Jeff, thanks for sitting down with me to talk about this. I appreciate you taking the time, my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So Jeff, for those who don't know you, would you introduce yourself and tell them not only who you are, but what it is you do for a living?
Yeah, I'm Jeff Lindner, and I'm a meteorologist with Harris County. I actually work for the Harris County Flood Control District, but I support all of the county agencies and departments when it comes to weather-related issues here in the county. And so, on a day-to-day basis, I manage our flood warning system. So it's our network of gauges that we have. We have about 200 of them across Harris County and even into the surrounding counties that we monitor rainfall and water levels in the creeks and bayous. And then obviously, when we have significant weather events, my job is to be the meteorologist that reports to the Harris County Office of Emergency Management. And, it's really a lot of briefings. You brief partner agencies, transportation partners. You talk about TxDOT, Toll Road Authority. When you're talking sort of winter type weather, like we just dealt with here in February, trying to keep the roadways open and everything. We also, have a lot of briefings with elected officials. Those are the persons that are making the decisions with respect to closing the county or closing the city or recommending evacuations in a hurricane type of an event. A lot of briefings with school districts. Obviously, school is a big issue when you deal with weather. So there's lots of briefings with school districts trying to make decisions, not only closing school, but there's a lot of extracurricular activities that are happening sometimes in the region and well outside of the region. And so people are traveling to Dallas and San Antonio and Austin sometimes for games and stuff like that. And so what's happening in other parts of the state is important to them. And then also, of course, passing the information and the decisions that are being made to the public, and that's really one of the probably primary things that I do during these types of activations, both on the media side of things and also the social media side of things, which at certain times can be more beneficial and important than even the media side of things, because so many people now get a lot of their information from the social media aspect during crisis.
So Jeff, what's your background? What did you study that equipped you for this type of work?
Yeah, so my background is in meteorology. I have a bachelor's of science in meteorology from Texas A&M University. I graduated in 2004 and started with the county actually as an internship in 2003, and that came out of an internship I had at Channel 11 in 2001 during Tropical Storm Allison. And so it kind of built on itself over time and has led to the position I have today. And really, it's a position that's kind of been created. There was no county meteorologist or anything like that before me. So it's kind of one of those positions that the person kind of created the position over time. And I think going forward, there will always be a need now for that, especially as big as Houston is and as many weather events and weather disasters that we have here in Houston and Southeast Texas.
What are some of the things that you've learned about kind of how weather systems work, how our world works, that have kind of stuck with you, stayed with you, or really been impressive to you? What are some of the things you've discovered about how weather works that make you go, "Wow, that's incredible"?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing looking back is and I think you might hear this a little bit as you go through careers with people, and especially people who have been in the careers for a long period of time, is that initially, the first few years out of college, it's like, wow, I can't believe this is happening. We had we had Hurricane Ike, we had Hurricane Katrina. When I was relatively new in my career, especially Katrina. And Katrina was one of those. I can't believe it's 2005, and we had almost 2,000 fatalities in the New Orleans area from a hurricane. I mean, this is 2005. This is not 1900, where there was very little warning. And so, it goes to show that you can still have large losses of life even today with all the technology we have, with all the warnings we have, with certain weather events. Katrina was one example of that. The tornadoes in Alabama in 2011, where we had over 400 people killed, is another example of that. And so, even today, with all the technology we have, with all the knowledge we have, with the ability to get warnings on your phone in your car when you're driving, which we couldn't have even thought of 30 years ago, we still have the potential to have, a lot of loss of life in certain
Mhm.
weather events if people either can't get to shelter or don't take it seriously. And sometimes that is the cases we face. When you start looking at the kind of the wow factor, one thing that's always amazing to me is when you go into these areas that have been hit by a tornado or a really strong hurricane, and I always take it back to imagine yourself going out and trying to pull up a shrub in your front yard with your bare hands. No digging. You just go out there and you try to yank it out of the ground, or you go try to pull a tree limb off of a tree. That's alive. It's a green live tree limb. Go try to yank it off that tree, and it's very very difficult to do. I mean, it is really hard to do. I can't do it. And you go out and you look at these disaster areas and you have entire trees just ripped right out of the ground, the roots and everything pulled right out of the ground. And obviously there's no human on earth that can do anything like that. And so it just goes to show the power we have when we start talking about some of these weather events, and the power of wind, and of course the power of water. You can imagine the power of water just moving an entire house, washing an entire house away, both at the beach or even inland on a river or stream that you have a flash flood on. And so I think that's the biggest thing that is always surprising. And every time you go into a disaster area, there's always something. There's always some item or aspect of it that is surprising, and that you see, and you're just like, it's well beyond what anybody on earth can do with their bare hands.
For all of our technological advancement, we can better understand the power that's in these natural forces. We can better prepare for it. But there's still, despite all of our technological advancements, there's nothing we can do to stop it. That's really the very humbling thing. That this world we live in is so strong. We're just a very small part of it, that when it wants to wield its power, we can't we can't stop it. Is that part of what you've seen?
Oh yeah, that you're absolutely right. I think as we advance, especially with technology and science, we start dealing with stuff like the pandemic, and you start talking about vaccines, and we have some control over the end result here. When it comes to weather and it comes to disasters, we have very little control over it. We can fight, and we've been fighting, and humans think that they can eventually beat the weather and win. But then there's a storm like Harvey, and we have been building flood control efforts in this county for decades, and there is always going to be a natural disaster that can overwhelm your mitigation efforts, just to simply put it. And so you look at that and you kind of look at all of the different things that can happen, and you have the different mitigation strategies in different places across the United States and even across the world. But we are really at the mercy of the weather, and all of that, and it can happen anytime, anywhere, from a huge wave, just like we saw last week off the coast of Louisiana. A storm system moved off the coast of Louisiana, capsized an oil type drilling boat out off the coast of Louisiana, and we had several fatalities with that. And these things go through hurricanes. They go through all of this type of stuff off the coast of Louisiana, and then just all of a sudden, this storm system moves off the coast and capsizes this boat, and you have this tragedy out there. And so, it happens from time to time, and I think we as humans, we always try to build and create things that can withstand the adverse effects of weather. We're going to go down to the beach after the hurricane comes through, and we're going to rebuild this house. That's the first thing you'll hear, is we're going to rebuild, and we're going to build it better and greater than it was last time. Okay. And and that structure could be there for 50 years or 60 years, or it could be lost again next year with another hurricane. And so while we understand what we can do to some degree, and build resilient areas that can withstand some of the stuff, we are not going to ever be able to build to the point where we're not going to have some level of damage from weather events.
What's something that when you see it in your line of work is something that is beautiful to you, for lack of a better term? We all in our various fields of study, we kind of nerd out on something and go, "Oh man, that's amazing," and it's kind of a beautiful thing. So for me, as a preacher and a Bible guy, like I get my hands on an old text and I go, "Oh, this is great. This is awesome." As a meteorologist, what is it that when you see something in particular maybe come across your radar or whatever it is, that when you see it, you go, "Oh, that's really beautiful." It stirs excitement and things in you.
Yeah, there's quite a few things actually, and I tend to keep my enthusiasm pretty low key, especially during these really big weather events, because there's always a lot of excitement already going on.
Mhm.
But let's just take the winter storm for example. A couple months ago, when you're looking at the model guidance, and that's what we look at as forecasters of what potentially could happen. It's not that we follow the model guidance exactly, but because there's biases in some of these models. But it gives us an idea of what the potential is we're facing. And when you start seeing temperatures in Houston, Texas of 8 and 9 degrees, it's really eye opening. It's that wow factor. Has it happened before? Yeah, it has happened before. It happened back in the 80s a couple times. Um, but in recent memory, we haven't had anything of that significance. Or when you're watching a radar, um, and you can see on the radar the classic what we call a hook echo develop with a thunderstorm, and that's a really telling sign, a warning sign, if you will, that the radar is indicating that there's likely some degree of a tornado developing or having developed. And we now have the capability with radar to actually see debris in the air. And so, the radar goes out and it strikes these what we call meteorological targets. And this is the raindrops or hail. But if it strikes tree limbs or leaves or shingles or boards or stuff like that, it'll actually indicate that there's something different in the air. And so we actually have, pretty good idea now within about 6 or 7 minutes, once a tornado has flung stuff in the air, that it's producing damage and confirmation that we actually do have a tornado, even if we don't have visual confirmation on the ground. And so, that's another one of those kind of wow moments. And also the ability, I think, of if you just stop and think for a minute, about hurricanes and typhoons and the amount of energy that these storms release. And they're necessary. A lot of people are like, well, why don't we just get rid of hurricanes? They're, with technological advances, we can get rid of them, right? And it's not that simple, because hurricanes do serve a purpose, and their purpose is to transport the heat at the equator northward into the poles. We have a heat budget here on the Earth, and so we warm constantly at the equator and we cool at our poles. And without hurricanes and the ocean currents that transport that heat northward toward the poles, our heat budget here on Earth would become horribly unbalanced. And so they actually do serve a purpose. But with that, they're massive, massive storms that release tremendous amounts of heat, and of course, the end result is end up cooling the water temperatures, which is their purpose. But if you just look at that and you think, well, you can put a nuclear weapon in there, or you can tow an iceberg out in front of it, or all this or that and everything else. That's just a pinprick, really, to the amount of energy that a hurricane can release.
I've never heard that before, Jeff. That hurricanes are essentially kind of doing a job within the ecological system. We and so on a larger scale, though they're unbelievably destructive from our perspective, they're serving a purpose in the whole system that we actually need it to serve. Is that what you're saying?
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you did away with hurricanes, let's just say we didn't have hurricanes or typhoons anymore. That's nature's way of helping to cool the ocean surface and the temperatures near the equator. And so, as you know, most of our solar energy comes in between 20 north and 20 south, or right around the equator, which is what we call the tropics. And if you don't have a way to dissipate that heat, the tropical areas would literally just keep warming and warming and warming until they burned up. And then the pole areas, which if you didn't have a way to transport heat to the poles, the North Pole or the South Pole, they would continue to get colder and colder. And so you have to have this heat budget where you transport heat from the tropics toward the poles, and you transport cold air from the poles toward the tropics. and hurricanes and ocean currents serve that purpose.
Wow, I had no idea about that. So I mean, but so perhaps as a Houstonian, it's a tough thing to say that we need these we need these hurricanes, right? It's from a holistic perspective, right?
Yeah, they serve a purpose. Obviously, they're when they interact with land, they're extraordinarily damaging. So, the best course of action is like what we see in the Eastern Pacific, where
Yeah.
most of the hurricanes move away from Mexico and they stay out over the water, or when they stay out over the water of the Atlantic Ocean. They're serving their purpose. They're doing their job of moving that heat from the equator toward the poles. It's when they interact with land, obviously, that we have big issues, and the attraction of everybody toward the coast over the last 50 years is also a big thing. It's not necessarily that hurricanes are getting worse, that we're having more of them, that they're getting stronger. It's the amount of stuff, just put it simply, that we put on the coast to be destroyed when these hurricanes come in. We've always had hurricanes. We've always had floods, and we will always have hurricanes, and we will always have floods. And there's obviously some potential there for influences on the climate system, be for whatever sources those influences come from. That can kind of change our weather patterns over time. We can have more hurricanes in one area, or more hurricanes in one ocean in some years versus other oceans. And usually when one ocean system is active, the other ones are kind of quiet. And that's what we kind of saw last year.
Hmm.
Atlantic was very, very active, but the Eastern Pacific was extremely quiet. And that's kind of what we see. And so when you start looking at it as the whole, when you start looking at it as the whole Earth, it is a balancing act that you see. Sometimes we look at it as we keep getting hit or we keep having floods in Houston. But if you look at it as a whole, it's a balancing act across the entire planet.
Hmm. Is there a connection there then to climate change? I mean, if the planet is getting warmer, it needs to release this heat more, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I think climate change is such a bad word nowadays. It's just you say climate change and people just start pulling their hair out, rolling their eyes. But simply put, the climate changes. The
Mhm.
climate changes for various reasons. If you go back and look at the Earth, thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of years ago, there's certainly periods of time in there where the Earth was warmer, and it wasn't necessarily due to any sort of CO2 emissions, but it was other things that were going on at the time that were causing a warmer planet. We went through ice ages and cool periods, and then we've been in this kind of warming period, if you will, since about the late 1970s or so. And there's a lot of research, if you will, that's kind of tied that to the Industrial Revolution that happened back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and the massive releases of carbon dioxide into the planet, which is a warming greenhouse gas. So, the more carbon dioxide you have, the more the solar radiation that hits the Earth, it gets trapped inside our atmosphere, and so it causes the planet to warm, at least the atmosphere to warm. And then over time, you get this feedback where the oceans begin to warm. And if you really look at the oceans are one of the bigger drivers of weather. I think a lot of people think, well, it's the air above us, right? That's the weather, but it's actually the oceans. If you look at the Earth, there's huge amounts of water on the planet, and so especially when the ocean system like the Atlantic or the Pacific, when you warm it a degree or two, that has huge implications for the weather and the climate. And so we pay a lot of attention to the oceans, and we don't fully understand the complete coupling of the oceans with the atmosphere. There's a lot of research that has been going on, especially in the Pacific, with El Nino and La Nina. El Nino is just the warming of the Pacific. La Nina is the cooling of the Pacific, and how that couples with the atmosphere out there, especially in the Eastern Pacific and then again in the Western Pacific, and how that affects worldwide weather patterns. And there's certainly some correlations. Again, we've only really known about the El Nino and La Nina since about the 1950s. It's certainly been happening long before that, but we just don't have a lot of data. And you're also talking about a place on Earth that's relatively data sparse, anyways. Besides ships and a few aircraft that fly through, the Pacific Ocean on a daily basis, you just don't get a lot of data out there. And so, what we can do today versus what we could do 5 years ago versus 20 years ago is just light years difference. And that's why I always caution about, climate change and our things getting worse and everything is because, we just had one of the most active hurricane seasons on record in the Atlantic. We had 30 named storms, but that doesn't mean we didn't have 30 named storms back in the 1700s or the 1600s. We just didn't know about it. We might have even had it in the late 1800s, but we didn't have satellites, and unless a ship passed through it in the Eastern Atlantic, you didn't know it was there. And so you have to kind of be careful and normalize sometimes and understand sometimes we just don't know what we don't know, especially about past weather events and everything. But certainly, one thing I think that most people can agree on, at least all scientists can agree on, is that the planet is warming. And to some degree, the oceans are warming. And we have seen significant warming, especially in our polar regions. Not so much toward the equator, but our polar regions, especially the North Pole, has seen significant warming, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. And is that a function of climate change? And is climate change, the current part of climate change that we're going through right now, a function of what we're doing as CO2 emissions? Or is there something else going on? And a lot of times when you look at climate and weather, there's multiple factors that are usually causing the change, whatever it is, to happen, to be occurring. And so it's I think it's very easy, and of course, with the whole topic becoming as political as it has become, it's very easy nowadays to just point the finger and say, "Oh, that's climate change." Hurricane Harvey was climate change. The winter storm was climate change. It doesn't work that way. The Harvey was going to happen regardless of climate change. The winter storm was going to happen regardless of climate change. Now, did climate change potentially make those storms a little bit worse? Maybe that is a possibility. And I think that's where we have to kind of find some common ground. Is we have to understand the climate's warming. Research in scientists at this point have enough data to show the climate's warming, but the cause of that warming is where you start to get into the debate, and how do you potentially try to reverse or negate that warming, even creates even greater debate. And so I've looked at some of the climate models and what they've shown, especially for Texas. We haven't seen anything here in the state of Texas so far except one aspect that the climate models have shown, and that aspect is the increasing of our overnight low temperatures in the summertime. And so we have seen that here locally. We have been setting what we call overnight low warm temperature records time and time again, especially at Galveston. And Galveston does have a very long period of record, going back well into the
Yeah.
1850s. So you do have something there that you can lean on. But the fact that last August, for the first 20 days or so of August, Galveston failed to fall below 80 degrees. And even some of their morning lows are around 85, 86, is pretty astounding. And that is one of the aspects that the climate models show here along the Texas coast, is an increase in the overnight low temperatures, especially in the summertime. One of the other things they show is an increase in drought, and we have yet to really see the magnitude of increase in drought that the climate models show. And so you kind of get these conflicting signals from the models. And to be honest, we do a good enough job. We try to do a good enough job just predicting the weather 5 to 7 days versus 50 or 60 years from now. But to your point about the warmer planet, what does it mean? Well, obviously, if the temperature is warmer, the air can hold more moisture, so you can get some heavier rain. So does that increase the flood potential, here in Houston? Yes, it does. How much is the question? Are we talking a half an inch when we have an afternoon thunderstorm? Or are we talking 5 inches when we have a
Mm.
20-inch rain? Because if you're talking 5 inches on top of a 20-inch rain, that's significant. If you're talking a half an inch extra rain in an afternoon thunderstorm, is probably not as significant. And those are the questions we just can't answer right now.
Mm. One last question for you, Jeff. Uh, is there anything that you've been able to see in terms of a weather event in person on the ground that's left an impression on you? I mean, obviously, my sense is that a lot of the times you're in an office setting, kind of reading the models and getting that information out to us, which all of us are so unbelievably appreciative of. Whenever somebody moves to Houston and they get worried about the weather, I say, well, here's who you follow on Twitter, and then you friend them on Facebook, and it's always you. You're doing such great work there. But has there been times when you've been kind of out in a system itself, and seen some of these things firsthand with your own eyes, and if so, what was that like?
So the last hurricane I was actually out in physically was Hurricane Ike. I stepped out for minutes, and I was at the Emergency Operations Center, and we had a back door we could go out and see what was going on. And of course, being the weather person I am, I have to see it. So I stepped out, and the thing I remember, and Ike wasn't anywhere near something like Laura or these other hurricanes. It was a kind of the roar of the wind, and you'd be standing there, and I'm sure the building had some of the effect of the wind coming around the building and stuff like that. But there were some trees, 15 or maybe 18 feet tall, and they would be virtually standing vertical straight up, and then all of a sudden there's just this powerful gust of wind would come around the side of the building, and these things would bend all the way over and almost touch the ground, and then they would snap right back up. And it was just, I think to me it's wind is always such a um, I don't know, exciting thing, because everybody looks at tornadoes, and they focus on the wind, and a lot of people don't necessarily focus on the water. But water is by far the most deadliest aspect of any storm that you're going to face. If you look at hurricanes, 90% of the fatalities in hurricanes are from the water. It's either from the rainfall or the storm surge. Very few people are actually killed by wind, but wind is what gets the excitement. Wind is what gets the video. Wind is what gets things flying through the air. And so you get that you get the reporter standing outside, trying to balance themselves, and the roof flying off, and all that kind of stuff. But I think one of the biggest impacts that for me is going after the fact. After the disasters happened, and I was in Louisiana after Hurricane Laura doing some storm surge marking over there, and you go into these areas down along the coast. This isn't Lake Charles. Everybody's focus is up at Lake Charles. This is down in the marsh areas of southern Louisiana, and you go to these homes, and these are people's homes. And I think sometimes when you see it on TV, it's easy to forget that these are where people live. This isn't the beach house. This isn't a second home. This is their actual primary house. And you walk into some of these homes, and you can see straight through the front door and right out the back wall. There's nothing left. There's some 2x4s. There might be a concrete slab, and there might be a roof. But just the sheer power of, in this case, this was water. This was a storm surge. The sheer power of the water to destroy things. And then I've also seen things that just you sit there and you scratch your head. Is you're in a house heavily damaged, be it from wind or water, and up on the top of a counter, everything is completely not touched. It is exactly the way it was when those folks left that house. And I saw that multiple times with Hurricane Laura in Louisiana, is specifically in the kitchen areas. Is the front wall of the house is gone, the back wall is gone. You can see straight through the structure, but on the kitchen counter, all of the coffee pot's still on the kitchen counter. The mugs are still hanging on the little thing on the kitchen counter, and you just have to sit there for a second and wonder, because when you're sitting here looking at the front wall gone and the back wall gone, the amount of force and water and wind that had to come through here to do that, how did it not blow everything off the counter? But it didn't, and it was there, and we've seen that in tornado surveys before also, and the entire house was completely gone, in the little closet under the stairwell were people took shelter as what survived, and or the interior bathroom where people took shelter is what survived. And so you see it, you hear the stories, but until you go out there and you actually see it, I think it's hard to really wrap your head around some of the things that can happen, and some of the damage that can happen. And we've been on surveys before, especially with tornadoes, we can find a piece of a pine needle, pine needles, maybe a little bit thicker than a sheet of paper, driven into the side of the tree, and it's sticking straight out of the side of the tree. And you just kind of sit there and, well, how did that happen? And you just chalk it up to, well, the wind was blowing 180 miles an hour, and things that defy logic happens.
Yeah.
And so those are the things that happen out there. But until you see it in real life, I think sometimes it's really hard to wrap your head around and understand.
The power and the forces at work in this world are difficult for us to wrap our minds around. But thank you, Jeff, for the work that you do. That's literally your job, trying to wrap your mind and our collective understanding around all these powerful forces that we have to deal with. Thanks for spending some time with me and chatting about the work that you do. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.